opening government today, we support autonomy, we support democracy, we support agency, and for that reason, we support a united Ireland. For the 5 main things in this speech. Firstly, some work in setup, and then 4 main points of substandard. Firstly, that there's an interest alignment between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Secondly, why will this be a prosperous nation? Thirdly, why is this good for the UK? And fourthly, why will this become a blueprint for other movements? Firstly, in terms of setup, 2 main things here. Firstly, that we would unify as Ireland, that Northern Ireland would become subsumed into the Republic of Ireland. 2 main things in terms of this subsumation. Firstly, they retain their place in the EU, and secondly, the UK just becomes the mainland area. Secondly, in terms of setup, we think this would kind of be an amicable reunification / divorce, and presumably there's a democratic vote that takes place where the reunification is overwhelmingly and increasingly popular. Now, in terms of 4 main points of substandard. Firstly, in terms of that there exists an interest alignment between Northern Ireland and Ireland. 3 main reasons under this point. Firstly, that these 2 nations have similar economies and needs. Secondly, that they have similar people. And thirdly, that the will of Northern Ireland is increasingly controlled by London, by the UK mainland. I'm going to get, later in my speech, I'm going to get into why that's a harmful thing. Okay, now onto the 2nd main point of substandard. Why would this be a prosperous nation? 3 broad points under this. Firstly, that it allows Ireland to remain in the EU. This is beneficial for 1 main reason with then some subpoints. Oh no, 3 main reasons. 3 main reasons beneficial. Firstly, that Northern Ireland voted overwhelmingly to stay in the EU. Therefore, this unification is allowing that democratic process to be respected. Secondly, that it allows them to be in the customs union, which brings lots of benefits such as free trade. It's really good for the economy, jobs, all that kind of stuff. And thirdly, that it avoids the border issue, where there's complications with the movement of goods and people. We help that issue under our side of the debate. Secondly, the 2nd reason why this would be a prosperous nation is that there are the many reasons that led to a divided Ireland no longer exist in our world today. We think these reasons are kind of 3 main things. Firstly, there used to be the Catholic Protestant divide, which is becoming increasingly irrelevant as as religion becomes less important in life, more people are atheists, etc. Secondly, we thought that there has been peace since the Good Friday Agreement. Thirdly, we thought that they have maintained a safe but open border for decades. There was no reason to believe that this wouldn't just continue or get better. Thirdly, in terms of the 3rd reason why this would be a prosperous nation, was that it reunifies divided territory and people. Particularly in the province of Ulster, we thought this was a really important benefit to our case today. In terms of the 3rd point of substandard, why did we think this was good for the UK? 2 main reasons here. Firstly, the majority Northern Ireland party in the UK government is Sinn Féin, which acts in an obstructionary and irregular way in the UK Parliament. And this means that if we are able to get rid of this party from the UK Parliament, it allows decision-making to occur in the UK Parliament. It is free from this kind of obstructionism. 3 main benefits to this. Firstly, UK interests get better represented. They're more able to push through the legislature that they think benefits them. Secondly, that you're more able to just get stuff done without people sticking in your way. And thirdly, we thought, that you don't have a disinterested actor who is not interested in your national interests, kind of clogging democracy and those kind of things. The 2nd reason why we thought this was good for the UK was that UK can get on with Brexit. 2 main reasons why we thought this was true. Firstly, without Northern Ireland, there was a much greater support for Brexit within There was much greater support of Brexit within the UK mainland. It would be much easier to justify and get public support for the measures they would need. Secondly, it would allow the UK, like London, to create a deal that more specifically benefits them. They don't have to take as many varying actors and their concerns into account. I will take closing.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, the Good Friday Agreement needs to be upheld. Do you support violating it, or if in 2016 they voted to remain, do you believe we should listen to Northern Ireland's actual voice?
I'm going to let Sweeney take that one, sorry. Okay, finally, in terms of how this acts as a blueprint for other movements, 2 main reasons for this. Firstly, we thought you were more likely to get an independent Scotland when you had this example leading the way. Secondly, we thought that if these territories leave Ireland and Scotland, that the UK is better incentivized incentivised to treat their remaining territories better. This looks like territories such as the Isle of Man, Jersey, Gibraltar. The UK is better incentivised to treat these places well, to give them better rights, better representation in their democracy, in order to incentivise these places to stay, in order to incentivise that economic activity to exist, etc. I think a particular benefit of our team's case is that the votes simply go further for Northern Ireland. They are no longer the minority in a UK parliament where they are a swing party or they're a really, really small actor. Where they have limited influence. They now become their own actor that is better able to engage with their national interests. Yeah, Billie.
Yeah, sure. Do you think that given the fact that they have to have a referendum, for example, for Scotland for the UK would just deny Scotland that agency if they thought that they were going to leave like Ireland?
I mean, can you repeat that, sorry?
At the moment, the UK has to agree whether or not you can have a referendum, for example, for Scotland. Do you think they're likely to deny it, for example, Ireland, please?
I think there's probably enough international pressure on the UK that if they did deny the people an independent vote for their autonomy, that there would be significant backlash from allies. So they would have to have that vote and see how it goes. Therefore, for those reasons, so proud to affirm.
The characterisation we just heard of what Ireland and Northern Ireland look like from opening government is literally delusional. There is a strong history of violence that literally is ongoing to this day. The IRA is still planting car bombs in Belfast, literally in the past 12 months. There are massive religious tensions that have not in fact been resolved. There is a history of ethnic difference due to British settler colonialism in Northern Ireland. The IRA and terrorist groups still exist and are active in recruiting incredibly heavily as a direct result of things like Brexit. They hate each other for the most part, but particularly Northern Ireland hates the concept of reunification. That is why they keep voting it down. That is why there is no actual push for that to happen other than from the Republic of Ireland. This is literally just colonialism by Ireland, in effect, is what we think in this debate. So, now that with that out of the way, 5 things. Firstly, to set up what this looks like. Secondly, why this violates the Good Friday Agreement, leads to mass resurgence of violence. Thirdly, why this probably forcibly displaces a lot of Northern Irish people. Fourthly, why they probably get economically exploited quite badly. And fifthly, why this causes the Irish left to just disappear. So in terms of setup, what do we think this looks like? I've already given you the characterization of ethnic troubles, of violence, of sectarianism. We think in those circumstances, and just empirically, huge numbers of Northern Irish people do not want Irish reunification. For opening government to prop, this would be popular and supported in a popular vote, that literally would never happen. Obviously at that stage you have to accept that this would happen in a context where the majority of Irish people do not want it, or at least a substantial portion of the Northern Irish people do not want it. And the consequence, and so as a result, we think this model looks like, in the worst case, forced relocations by the Irish state, but more realistically, we think it looks like a mass exodus of people from Northern Ireland because they do not consent to being governed by a state that they don't recognise as legitimate, that they don't have anything in common with. And we think at minimum, it looks like a widespread outbreak of political violence and things like terrorism, just like the good old days of the Troubles. Not only is this practically likely to be a disaster in how this is implemented, but we think it's literally morally untenable, right? You are literally forcing these people to be governed by a state they do not recognise without their consent. That principle harm alone is easily the biggest contribution you're going to hear in this debate. That wins this debate from OO on its own. But note they also talk about, they voted to stay within the EU, so that democratic right is probably comes into play here. Obviously the EU is less important than your actual state and government in terms of importance. That is not a comparative that everyone will win. So, substantive then, first point, why does this violate the Good Friday Agreement and lead to a resurgence of violence? The thing you have to know about this is that it was signed very recently after decades of violence and painstaking negotiations and incredible shows of good faith by people like Tony Blair, like the IRA leaders and then became Sinn Féin. Literally the only thing that is stopping the IRA and also unionists from resuming terrorism is the fact that this agreement has to this point been largely respected. There is no hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, right? There is genuine, a degree of respect for each side's autonomy. At the point at which you are forcibly reunifying them with at least a substantial portion of the population opposed to that, that literally doesn't just violate one clause of that treaty. That just destroys the entire agreement and the entire function of it. And at that stage, there's absolutely no reason for these actors to not re-engage in terrorism because they feel particularly strongly about Ulster unionist nationalism. They feel particularly strongly that they do not respect these governments. That using violence to overthrow illegitimate rulers is legitimate use of force. And we think the consequences of that are fourfold. Firstly, the resumption of violence, which is already coming back during the Brexit. Like I told you, that there was a journalist in Belfast killed by a car bomb literally within the past 12 months. And that is likely to be widespread and have serious consequences for a huge number of innocent victims, even people who aren't directly killed or affected. The emotional consequences of that, the mental health consequences, but also just in terms of general stability and the ability of governments to provide order is massively undermined in those circumstances. Secondly, there is absolutely no prospect for a future solution to any outbreak of violence because you've pretty comprehensively demonstrated that diplomacy doesn't mean anything and governments will go back on their word all the time. That just massively undermines norms of diplomacy and also just democracy. Thirdly, this is literally a golden opportunity for propaganda to recruit to things like militia groups, which are already relatively active in Ireland and Northern Ireland. That is a long-term disaster because you're now empowering actors who are, exist parallel and parasitically on the state over the long term to develop in a way which means you're going to destabilize the entire country for probably decades to come. And fourthly, it just establishes an entirely correct narrative that the government cannot be trusted and that you have been betrayed. Usually when countries start having national narratives about betrayal, it ends pretty poorly. Look at what happened after World War I in Germany. Obviously in those circumstances, you are likely to see a mass resurgence of violence with no end in sight because you as an actor, as the Irish government, or even as the Northern Irish former government or the UK, have lost all legitimacy in the eyes of the people. You have no capacity to actually enforce your powers in any meaningful way. Thirdly then, why does this lead to forcible, secondly and substantive, why does this lead to forcible displacement? We would note that many are probably just going to refuse to accept the legitimacy of unified Ireland, and they're well within their right to do so. We think they're likely to be coerced by the Irish state in the worst case, but more realistically by their own feelings or their economic circumstances to just leave Northern Ireland or uproot and leave. And the kinds of people who are capable of doing that are the ones who have the capacity to do things like investment, to do things like make their communities better places to live. What that leaves is an underclass of people left behind who are unable to do things have a decent quality of life. And that has a number of consequences. Firstly, you're going to see a mass upsurgence in violence, but also in things like populism, because you've literally been left behind. This is the white working class who are no longer being respected by their government. Secondly, it leads to mass class stratification because the Irish state, the Northern Ireland is far smaller in population, but it's also ethnically and religiously different to Ireland, which means there's very little incentive for the Irish government to actively help these areas and try to bring them up to scratch. We think a more realistic situation is just what happened after the Berlin Wall fell, and East Germany has been poorer ever since because the state doesn't really give that much of a shit. But we'll also note there's a lot of other harms. I'll take a point from closing if you've got one before I run out of time. Protected time? No? Anything? Gee, that's embarrassing. All right. There's also a massive loss of culture and connection to land for people who might have lived in this land for generations, who have a strong, emotional or, familial connection to this land. There's also just likely to be mass discrimination. You are literally, the vast majority of Northern Irish people are of a different ethnicity to the rest of Ireland, at least in some capacity. There is still religious discrimination that goes on. Finally, thirdly then, on economic exploitation, Northern Ireland is much poorer than the rest of Ireland, right? They are very manufacturing and extractive industry heavy. They are a hollow shell of a region. It's not at all, Annabelle tries to tell you, similar to the Irish economy, which is basically a glorified tax haven. And at that point, you just duplicate the end of the Soviet Union when these states, which are now poorer, have no real investment coming into them because all the productive people are leaving, but also because the state doesn't really care that much. They are prone to be ignored by the government. We would also note it's probably principally a better thing to keep this economic burden of a region on England as punishment for being English. Finally, then, why does the Irish left disappear? Now, we note that Sinn Féin, the Irish Left Party, is heavily dependent on nationalism to make its appeals. At the point at which there is now a unified Irish state, they lose a huge selling point, a point of differentiation with their centre-right opposition like Fianna Fáil, and those parties already likely dominate the system, which means you see less representation of the Irish left, you see more discrimination and less redistribution in Ireland. Annabelle tells us about obstructionism in the UK Parliament. I think firstly, the Sinn Féin are Irish, they're not Northern Irish, they don't sit in the UK Parliament. But secondly, the United Kingdom suffering from obstructionism is obviously a clear benefit. That also wins us this debate by a mile. At the end of this, they have no idea what Ireland actually looks like. That is why all of their material completely falls out of this debate. I won't take this by a mile.
would have been a really good speech had it been presented in 1995. Unfortunately, the reality is we live in 2021, where the circumstances of Northern Ireland and Ireland in particular are extraordinarily different to what they once were. There's increasing calls in Northern Ireland uniquely for reunification that have also been largely met receptively by the people of Ireland. Note as well that a lot of the analysis that's predicated by the voting opposition side on how poorly Northern Ireland is doing, how comparatively terribly it is doing in comparison to Ireland, is a precise reason why they want to get the fuck out of the present situation they're in, where they're consistently met with neglect by the United Kingdom, where they're not able to engage or be represented sufficiently by the United Kingdom's Parliament, where they ought to go to Ireland. And of course, the reunification process will involve messiness. Of course, it will involve violence. That violence is far lesser than it could have been, and will lead to a more successful Ireland long term. Let's look at a few things in this speech. First, what Ireland and Northern Ireland relations actually look like, engaging with true conceptualisation of this debate. Secondly, on why this is not an unjust colonialist measure that is being taken. Thirdly, on why Northern Ireland is presently struggling, and why the only reason it could be rectified is reunification with Ireland. Finally, some miscellaneous material isn't dealt with in any meaningful capacity by opening opposition. Firstly, in terms of what Ireland and Northern Ireland relations look like, as I've already flagged, I think a lot of the analysis that comes from opening opposition is particularly backward looking. I think a lot of the reasons that they rely on are hard ones that have been subsumed. Yes, it is true that things like terrorism will continue to exist, but note that to the extent that terrorism exists under the status quo, it is unlikely necessarily there'll be some massive explosion of it, pardon the pun, at the point where reunification exists, insofar as it's always an ongoing threat perennially, irrespective of what Irish policy is actually pursued. Secondly, to the extent that we can prove that Ireland is more likely to be a prosperous nation at the point where it gets reunified, then even if that reunification process has 5 years of increased harm from the status quo, the long-term benefits will actually ease the tensions that exist. It'll be far more likely people within Northern Ireland and Ireland are located in such a way it's unlikely those tensions will exist. No, extremism then is not something that's particularly unique as a harm on our side. Second thing to note is I think that speech almost entirely ignores the context that is particularly important in this debate, which is Brexit and the vote that occurred with that, where the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union, where Northern Ireland's status then is in limbo. The only response we get is that, well, the EU is far less important than your own home nation. But I'd actually query whether that's true, particularly in the context of Northern Ireland, and that's for a few reasons. Firstly, the primary financial benefits that are obtained from Northern Ireland don't come from the United Kingdom, they come from the European Union, which is why in circumstances such as that, it's more justified to pursue being in Europe than it is to pursue remaining in the United Kingdom. The second thing to say is Northern Ireland is just fucking treated like shit, and moreover, the politicians who do represent them in many circumstances don't actually engage with the UK Parliament in a way that's particularly meaningful. Sam just fucking lies when he says Sinn Féin only exists in Ireland. Feel free to check it out. Sinn Féin are a majority party in Ireland and have extraordinarily been on the rise in Northern Ireland in the past few elections, and to the extent that Sinn Féin's major method of engaging with the United Kingdom Parliament is to not fucking rock up to it in the first place, means the capacity for Northern Ireland to actually be represented in an institution that they hold anthemic to its very object means it is unlikely that Northern Ireland is able to get actually useful policies that are likely to make it far better, meaning the United Kingdom does not represent them. The only entity that has the propensity to represent them is either Ireland, who will still care for its northern neighbour because of the deep historical ties that exist with them, or secondarily the European Union, who they voted to remain with overwhelmingly because of the financial benefits that exist with them. The third thing to note though is you ought just consider, even though it has been true, a lot of Sam's analysis, that Northern Ireland has been particularly oppositionary to any form of reunification, note that the uptick in support for unification has come since Brexit, meaning that is further evidence that the Brexit vote might in and of itself be justification enough to actually overturn this sort of, idea that opening opposition propagates, which is that you should never prioritise some sort of international organisation than your own nation. Note as well, this doesn't matter a whole heap in the debate, because your own nation will actually change at the point where you reunify with Ireland. It's a silly analysis, and it ought to be engaged with more deeply, hopefully closing this actual work with respect to Brexit. No, thank you. Third thing to note though, which largely rebuffs a lot of the analysis that opening opposition provide, is to say that Irish reunification doesn't need to just fucking bang happen tomorrow, suddenly a bunch of bombs will go off. Of course this is a process which will evolve agreements over time. Of course this will involve contemplation over the Good Friday Agreement, over the border agreements that are presently in place, over the way that it will be reunified. It's just a long-term project that might exist, meaning it's not as if it just rushes back in, rather Northern Ireland is given time to adapt, which far outweighs and also circumvents a lot of the harms that opening opposition talk to you about. No, thank you. That is what Northern Ireland and Irish relations actually look like. We also don't get sufficient responsiveness to a lot of the material we tell you about how this nation has the propensity to be particularly prosperous. that is, avoiding issues with the island border that will continue to exist insofar as Brexit exists, etc. Second thing I want to deal with is this claim this is an unjust policy to pursue. This is effectively colonialism from the Republic of Ireland. Firstly, fucking lol. The UK probably deserves a bit of colonialism in response to that which occurs. But secondly, even if we will meet that challenge to the extent that the UK has historically treated Ireland as a collective entity fucking abysmally. The only reason Northern Ireland exists in the first place is because of massive settlers flooded across the channel and consequently settled a lot of Ireland, displaced people who lived in the Republic of Ireland and have robbed them of their ancestral and historical homeland insofar as it's carved out now a part of Northern Ireland, which again a lot of people in Northern Ireland are happy at last to be subsumed into the Republic of Ireland, meaning that there was some justification at least, from the colonial perspective I suppose, to suggest that this country should be one that is unified. I'll take opening if you've got some.
Yeah, sure. The original process to divide up the Irish state was also a long process with lots of consultation. Still led to a massive outbreak of violence. How is this not analogous?
Because the circumstances have, of course, changed. The original agreements that led to the fucking borders that, created the state of, Tanzania or whatever, were of course arduous itself. But that doesn't mean that those continue to exist to this very day. The borders created around any country might have involved arduous processes, but of course the people within those countries and their own beliefs, their own desires and wishes can change over time, meaning you can reverse course on policies that are particularly pernicious, especially if they're harmful. Final thing I want to talk about in this debate, also responsive to opening opposition, is this idea of Northern Ireland demographics and the reunification will be particularly awful for them. And the main analysis here is Northern Ireland is extremely poor. If they get reunified, they'll be left behind. Note firstly, having you fucking interrogate why they're poor in the first place is probably because of the neglect they suffer at the hands of the UK to begin with. It's probably because they're cut off from their major financial boon in the European Union increasingly, meaning that at the point where you can ameliorate a lot of those issues, at the point where Irish people care about or other Irish people, is far more likely you're actually able to result in benefits for those issues. Final things I want to note is we don't get sufficient responsiveness to other substantive material that we provide to you. This gives a blueprint for other movements, but also that it's good for the United Kingdom insofar as it removes an obstructionist party in Sinn Féin and the DUP who engage in this to a certain extent from their parliament and gives them more agency to actually make decisions that will affect what is left of the UK at the end. But also, insofar as the House of Commons is on a knife's edge, a disinterested act of clogging democracy is possible. It allows the UK to get on with Brexit. I don't know, probably 1 minute left after.
Thank you very much.
It may be true that reunification may be more popular in Northern Ireland than it was in 1998. That does not by any means mean that it is popular. There is a reason why the Northern Irish do not want to reunify, and that's because they know that they will be screwed over when they do. And that's the reason why a referendum, if they ever propose that, would never get through. And what they are proposing is forced reunification. It's forced removal of people from their homeland when they're forced to leave to avoid terrorist bombings of the cities that they've lived in their entire lives. We think that is unjust. We think that takes OG out of the debate, and that's why we're going to win. Okay, 4 things I'm going to do. Firstly, deal with characterization, then the principle, then the effect on this new Ireland, split into violence, economic and political effects, and finally the effect on the displaced in the UK, which I'll note that we got literally no response to from opening government. Okay, characterization. Do the Northern Irish want reunification? Because they asserted that they would, and they asserted that there'd be a popular vote, which means they would. But the Northern Irish don't want reunification, and there's 5 reasons. There's probably way more reasons why they don't, but let me give you 5 of them, right? Because they would be a minority in this new country, where they'd have regular Southern Irish people moving into where they've lived and pushing them out of their homeland. Because they literally don't accept the legitimacy of the Irish state, because it's something that's fundamentally oppressed them for years. Thirdly, because religious differences still exist and are still a huge part, right? It's not enough for them to say at PM that, people are more atheists now, so actually they don't hate each other anymore. Because that's simply not true, because these people still have deep-down beliefs that their parents and their grandparents have been taught from a young age that these are people who are literally the devil, who've been taught not to ever be friends with them or whatever. 4, they're just incredibly nationalist, right? The fact that they've had a whole bunch of violence, a whole bunch of sentiment in the past means that the present reality of discourse, something that's very anti-unification, even if on the fringes it's becoming more popular. Finally, just terrorist violence is probably a pretty big deterrent to people. If the Irish are bombing you every year or so, that probably means you're not going to want to join the Irish state. At the end of all of those, you probably have to accept in this debate that the most likely option is that the Northern Irish at least do not want to unify. We would say it's not even clear that there's a majority of the Southern Irish that want to unify as well, but like insofar as that's not the thing that matters as much, that's fine. Sweeney tells you that the circumstances are different now. That was completely asserted. He literally said it wasn't 1995 and then gave no reason why it was different besides people are better now. It's literally getting worse because of tensions due to Brexit. Note that tensions won't be fixed because you're reunifying it. It's just the fact that those tensions are there. But also it's standing on a knife edge, right? The Good Friday Agreement is literally the only thing stopping that violence from going forward. At the point where you forcibly undermine that agreement, you're only going to encourage those on the fringes of those societies to encourage more violence, to recruit more people. I'll talk about that in a bit. I'll take closing notes.
Are all your comments about some people not wanting to live in Ireland symmetric to a number of people in Northern Ireland not wanting to be a part of the UK?
I think there are some people in Northern Ireland that don't want to be a part of the UK, but that is a significantly less large proportion than the people who don't want to be a part of Ireland. But that's because of all the reasons I've given you. Because the UK may economically neglect Northern Ireland a little bit, but it's nowhere near as bad as like literally terrorism, literally violence, literally the Troubles, or like any of the economic neglect that Ireland would do that we've proved would happen under their side of the house. Okay, why is it unjust? Because Trotter tells you that it's morally untenable to force these people to be governed. That is literally so much more important than Sweeney ever gives airtime to in this debate. It's not enough for him to say, well, the UK like colonized this in the past, so it's probably fair that they get it back, because we don't care about the UK here. It's the Northern Irish people that are suffering here. It's the fact that they are losing their autonomy, they are losing a state that they believe is actually something that's legitimate. We don't actually care what the UK thinks there. They say that the EU actually is really important. It's simply not as important as your national identity. But importantly, even if it was, you have to weigh that against all the other harms that we're going to bring in this debate. And importantly, just because Ireland is doing better than Northern Ireland, that doesn't mean that Northern Ireland would do better if it was part of Ireland. So because of that, we think it's legitimate for these people not to want that. We think it's fine for Sinn Féin to not go to the UK Parliament because people vote for that knowing that that's what they want to do. Okay, moving on to the effect on this new Ireland. Firstly, let's talk about violence, because fundamentally this violates the Good Friday Agreements. Why is violence particularly likely to happen? 5 reasons. Firstly, because of that. There's no significant peace agreement to be upheld. There's no reason why people wouldn't do it. Secondly, because there's a significant minority or majority from both sides that are against reunification. Those people want to make a statement because they're angry at the point where they thought they could trust in this agreement, they thought they could trust in the status quo. Even if they didn't have strongly held beliefs beforehand, people are going to rile them up. People are going to say this is the worst thing that's ever happened, and you're going to get bombings. You're going to get people dying for what? Thirdly, it's easy to recruit new people to the terrorist cause if you think there's a general sentiment that this is a bad thing, or even if it's a good thing that must be happening, you now want to have fighters to fight the terrorists, and there's just going to be an increase of violence in the region. 4, the government can no longer claim moral legitimacy because it's literally undermined one of its own agreements, which means it's unable to come back against the terrorists as party. 5thly, the Ulster Unionists will literally nuke Belfast. That's probably pretty bad. That probably means you're going to get a whole bunch of harms there. Let's talk about economic effects. Because note, we only had 30 seconds of analysis from Sweeney as to why these wouldn't matter. We thought it was actually a pretty significant part of Sound Siege. Firstly, we told you that Northern Ireland, in general, tends to be poorer. They're probably going to be discriminated against by rich Irish companies that are the benefits of tax havens. But secondly, because only the poorest Northern Irish will remain, because the ones with the ability to leave the UK might be more likely to do so. Thirdly, we say that the reunification with the EU is probably likely to fail. At the very least, it's going to be years of negotiations before you actually get to a point where it's like Brexit took 5 years, why wouldn't this be the same thing? So at this point, we think it's probably unlikely that any marginal benefit you get from rejoining the EU is going to be beneficial to the Northern Irish people when weighed up against all those specific economic harms to them that comes from the oppression from the Irish state. Political effects. We told you our Sinn Féin will die in the Irish state because it literally won't have a platform anymore. Sweeney is pumping the air because he thinks that's great. But that's particularly harmful because then you don't have a left-wing party in Ireland. Then you're left with right-wing populist parties with no democratic accountability who are literally going to enforce the will of all these angry people who like violence. That's probably not particularly great. Finally, let's talk about the effects of the displaced and those living in UK UK. We got no response to this material. We think it was particularly damaging to the government case that they're unable to deal with this. Because these were people who may have like more assets than the people leaving Ireland, but they're now heading to a much worse life in the UK, where they won't be able to like retain the cultural or community ties with the land that they've lived on, or their families lived on for hundreds of years, where they don't have any of those assets anymore, where because they face racism in the UK, because they're pushed to the poorest parts of the UK, the people there don't like them because they think that the Irish people are bad because they're oppressing the Northern Irish. At that point, that is a significant group of people that you have to grapple with in this debate. If you believe that reunification will lead to violence, if you believe it will lead to economic oppression, if you believe it will lead to political subjugation, that is why you should vote side off.
TVs. It's so you can see the screen when you're presenting.
Some form of exam is happening here at midnight.
Cool. Everyone good? 2 points of extension for closing government. Firstly, an actual explanation as to how the process of reunification would occur, filling in the big gap in opening government's case, and also addressing sort of the op contention that, Belfast I think in claim. And secondly, an explanation as to the actual set of benefits that this policy would achieve in more detail than sort of the combined 10 arguments Top Up gave you, none of which did much in the debate. Firstly, on how reunification occurs, this is a primary contention of the op bench, just that this would violate the Good Friday Agreement and that would be incredibly violent. We disprove that. That knocks OO out of debate because they literally don't give you anything else. So, why is it that this does not occur? Firstly, and Sweeney kind of hints at this in his deputy speech, huge timescale problem in the OO case, right? We're talking about changing the way that states operate. That does not happen on the scale of months, that happens on the scale of a decade or longer. So obviously this is not something that will happen quickly. For example, Brexit is probably one of the most rushed attempts at moving a state into or out of a union in history, and that still took 5 years to complete. We think that this process would be something like looking to have the vote at the end of the decade for something, considering all the requirements that would need to occur first. Like you'd need the Home Minister of the UK to agree that there was a requirement for a vote, agree to hold the vote, you would have to set up the infrastructure for the vote, look at the proposals as to what would occur if the vote succeeded and so on. So we don't think this is something that would occur instantly. Secondly though, and why it is not undemocratic, is simply because of the large amount of demographic change that has occurred and will continue to occur by the time the vote occurs. Firstly, as opening government points out, people are much less religious, but importantly, now there are actually fewer Protestants and Catholics left in Northern Ireland. Secondly, there is increasing distaste for UK colonialism amongst younger voters, which is why they're particularly likely to lean towards reunification. And thirdly, they weren't alive during the Troubles. They don't hold those sentiments. The people who would rejoin the IRA and New Belfast are going to die off by the time this vote occurs. They're going to be stuck in the nursing home and unable to engage in that policy in the first place. The people who are under 45 at the moment primarily support reunification, and that is exactly who will be the vast majority of the voter base when this vote occurs, which explains why that harm does not occur, which explains why it occurs peacefully. The last thing to say here is just that the polls that have occurred are relatively inaccurate because they tend to be boycotted by one side or the other for a variety of political reasons, because they oppose the legitimacy of the concept in the first place, or that they feel that their voice will not be represented. So I don't think you can adequately look to past polls as evidence of what is actually the sentiments. Look to the structural reasoning we provide. Right. Having then demonstrated that this reunification can occur and will occur peacefully, what are the set of benefits that this is likely to provide for Ireland? Yeah, firstly, OO.
Yeah, you're opposing even going to a poll about reunification. Doesn't that suggest they probably don't want it?
No. Obviously, if you believe the election will be illegitimate, you don't go to the polls. It doesn't mean you don't believe in any of the options being provided. Obviously, this is less likely to face those problems for the structural reasons we provide, right? It would be done properly over a period of time and so on. You not responding to a poll does not mean, to a referendum that occurred 30 years ago during the Troubles, does not mean that you would not do so now. So, what are the benefits to Ireland? Firstly, and this is important, explaining why the status quo is bad and there's actually an imperative for change to occur. Firstly, we would point to the fact that there has been significant economic neglect of Northern Ireland for a series of reasons. Firstly, the structure of the UK is one where all of the productive parts of the country are in the south of England, primarily for the reason that Margaret Thatcher basically killed all of the industry that existed in the north, which are things like the jobs that people in Northern Ireland used to have. Secondly, they're reliant therefore on London for access to funding in order to be able to provide things like services to their people. That money is not forthcoming for the reason that the government that is in power, the Tories, have a very wide margin and do not need coalition partners or need to hand out money to parties like the DUP in order to secure their loyalty because they won by such a landslide victory. And they're more concerned with handing out money to marginal constituencies like Hartlepool in order to win Labour seats and increase the majority than to keep ones in Northern Ireland, which is why those areas have received significant neglect in recent years. Thirdly, because no UK party, like no English party actually, contests the elections in Ireland, they don't have any reason to care about those voters except through the indirect proxy mechanism of negotiating with parties that do get elected there, like Sinn Féin and the DUP in the first place. But fourthly, because there's been a significant amount of uncertainty over the fate of Northern Ireland, companies are unwilling to invest in that area, and that means that it's not economically productive. And fifthly, the goods and customs border has been particularly devastating as a result of Brexit. That is to say, like, mail and parcels do not get through now oftentimes. Supermarket shelves are often bare because UK companies like Tesco just pulled out of the area because they don't want to operate across the goods and customs border, which is exactly why things are dangerous. Lastly, in response to that point about like violence, the UBF and other groups have literally armed up in response to the violation of the Good Friday Agreement that the customs border is seen to impose. The idea that Northern Ireland is being separated from the UK is in of itself a harm, which means that just doing nothing in the status quo is not like the peaceful option. It invites just as much scorn and just as much violence as the alternative. The second reason why the status quo is bad, though, is that it lacks representation, right? Like, this is a part of the country that overwhelmingly wants things like healthcare, rent control, equality, progressivism, and membership in the EU, exactly the kinds of things the Tory government will never deliver to them, noting that as a government that is unlikely to get out of power anytime in the future. Look at how, first Corbyn got absolutely railed, and now, Keir Starmer just lost Hartlepool by a shocking margin. It's probably something they're not going to get in the near term. We've explained there are no incentives to care about these people in the near term, which is exactly why things are likely to get much worse for them. Why are all these problems then fixed by independence? A couple of reasons. Firstly, being entered into the EU immediately grants a series of benefits. Firstly, immigration to all other EU countries under the Schengen Agreement. Secondly, access to courts and appeals against decisions that Ireland has, which is a far more powerful accountability mechanism than the Tory government in the UK provides. And thirdly, things like checks and balances in the way that the EU functions and the way that it imposes rules and stuff on parties that operate there. Secondly, access to the EU markets. The euro is a more stable currency than the pound. Secondly, it's a larger market to trade with. Thirdly, you have access to common debt, which lowers borrowing costs and means you can invest in infrastructure and services. Fourthly, there's no goods border, which kind of means you can actually trade with, the UK better than you can now. Thirdly, it means that politicians actually have incentives to care because they now actually need to win the voters of Northern Ireland, unlike now where they're kind of ignored. They say, well, Sinn Féin dies. No one wants to vote for a left-wing party. Why should it exist? Left-wing policy isn't intrinsically good, but we tell you they probably would exist. Lastly, though, they would be brought up to speed because, the next-gen European fund of $750 billion exists as a post-COVID recovery fund, so it'd probably be an easy way to deploy that money and an easy way to get access to a very large amount of money. Considering that, there's common debt now, it'd probably be very easy to solve that problem. At the end of this debate, status quo was really bad. This was easily solved, and the solution was very good. Incredibly proud to govern.
I'd like to thank.
For a group of great debaters, no one knows the fuck about Ireland. So I'm going to give a little bit of an explanation, a bit about Arin and the current context and who we should care about. But I want to note that Udai was alive when the Troubles were happening. The understanding of, oh my goodness, no one is alive when the Troubles, they ended in 1998. It's kind of a bit of a confusing time for everyone. The important thing then to realise is this was 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s was when the Troubles were happening. This is literally your parents, if it is not you. This is your grandparents. And the important thing to then realise is everyone talked about Northern Ireland as if they were the actor we need to care most about. I'm going to first talk about why this is worse for the interest of Ireland itself and why that is probably the actor we care more about, given they're the ones with the huge history of, for example, discrimination and being attacked by Northern Ireland. So probably are the actor you probably should broadly be more sympathetic about because no one knows shit about Ireland. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why it actually is better for Northern Ireland later on, but I'm just going to have a quick bit of rebuttal here to Udai, because I want to note that the explanation mechanism for why it would not be violent, but given that is completely untrue given just the dates of when it was, as well as, for example, the logic of it was not just that. The Republic of Ireland had a penal code that meant you could not buy property if you were like a Catholic in Ireland. It meant that you literally were living in poverty. It meant that you were forbidden from expressing your religious beliefs if you were not Anglican. Like there were huge amounts of problems for Catholics in Ireland, in the whole of Ireland, that mean that the reason why they wanted, for example, Ireland to leave the UK was because they wanted a united Ireland that no longer had the UK as a part of it, because they were angry, for example, about the Anglicanization of Northern Ireland. The important thing to then realise is the impetus for reunification was there in the 1960s, but is no longer now. 4 parts then about why reunification is probably one that's going to go incredibly badly for the Republic of Ireland. The first thing we want to say is quite obviously this will annoy the UK. Yeah? As if the UK will be angry by this. We're not going to do the thing of maybe they would start bombing things, which sounds a bit weird, but I will give explanation of why this is probably incredibly anti, for example, your own interests. The first thing is, they're currently reliant on a $580 billion trade deal with the UK for example, huge amounts of investment. They needed to keep their tax haven that allows, for example, for these companies to have the subsidies. And I know that I can't explain why this $580 billion trade deal is true, but I did a fucking lot of matter prepping, and I know about it. The next thing to then talk about the UK and stuff like that is they also, for example, are pretty anti when people, for example, do things like actively reclaim territory. They tend to respond in ways that are particularly aggressive, and Tories are notorious for doing this in ways that are particularly aggressive, and given Udai's analysis for Tories would remain in power, it probably seems likely they do not like this. Note that when I PO'd Annabelle about the Scottish referendum, they literally denied last year Scottish people to have a referendum in by the UK. And that sort of stuff seems to indicate they're pretty anti people, for example, having independence movements, and they probably likely clamp down on Ireland for these sort of actions and deny them the trade deal, which is coming up for renegotiation, which is probably pretty bad for Irish development in the future. The second thing to then talk about, though, is we think that quite literally, Ireland has very little other prospects if it's not, for example, for the UK. It's its main trade dealer. It's like solely reliant on the UK for a bunch of, for example, resources. But also note, we think that you are able to, for example, negotiate a soft border in an easier way than you are able to negotiate reunification. Yeah? As in, like, if this debate is, which policy can we more easily negotiate? A soft border with the UK that means people can more easily see their family, or one that literally means the UK gives up land? There is obviously one that is literally so much fucking easier to explain, to have been popular, and to have something that broadly gets support that means the Tories agree to it, which means that you do not have any of the harms of opening government, because people can easily move, things like that, but you get literally none of the harms, for example, that opening opposition suggests, or that we do, which is literally that this is probably one that will deny the Republic of Ireland a huge amount of sovereignty, for a few reasons. The first thing to say is we think the North are pretty evil, and we're pretty fine with them remaining not unified with Ireland for that sort of reason. They literally help them in oppression. But the second thing I think to say is that more broadly, the North are often the people who are particularly antagonistic towards the South in ways that are particularly bad. They also have access to UK weaponry and things like that mean the Republic of Ireland probably would be the ones that suffer the most. The next thing I want to talk about quite briefly is why we think that even if we do care more about Northern Ireland, why we think the UK has great incentives to actually invest in Northern Ireland. The first thing is, maybe it is true that currently they're not giving a huge amount of investment to the Northern Ireland, but we think that is likely to change. Firstly, as I've already indicated, they do not, for example, want countries to leave, and the fact that Scotland and Ireland are having, for example, more leave movements means they have huge amounts of incentives to invest in those regions, to give them a lot of money, to give them a lot of the autonomy and stuff like that. That means they do not want to leave. So that means the UK is able to remain as a power and not be seen as weakening, but is not one that actually has to deal with any of those sort of problems. The second thing that we want to say, actually, I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah, obviously the soft border is hard to negotiate because it requires the EU to get involved. They don't want that to occur because they're trying to punish Britain for leaving. It's why they're making it so painful for them. It's much easier to just negotiate reunification.
What the fuck? Like, obviously it's harder to negotiate reunification with the UK is literally going to give up all of its land. Also, it's not true. The EU did offer a soft border. The Tories just decided to have particularly different interests when it came to the trade deal, so did not accept that offer. It's not true they cannot offer this soft border. Also, the EU's interest is probably not to have a war, yeah? So if it's like, hey, we'll have a really long, costly fucking fight over Ireland, or we'll have a soft border, there probably is in their interest economically and well as socially to sort of just allow for Ireland to have that sort of thing to happen. The next thing I then want to talk about is why we think that actually other UK maybe acts in ways that will subdue the Republic of Ireland long term if they do this. The first thing is obviously, for example, the UK has a lot more power, has a lot more police, and for example, what happened in, for example, the Troubles is they actively put in a police state in, for example, the Republic of the Northern Ireland, which is bad both for the Northern Ireland of any sense of autonomy you want to gain. But secondly, it's obviously bad for the Republic of Ireland because, for example, that police state is one of the main leading causes of violence that happened during the Troubles. They often did things like actually stirred up insurgent movements within Republic of Ireland to undermine the whole movement more broadly. And thirdly, often did things like actively made Ireland seem as the worst actor here, because the Republic of Ireland is one that's causing this harm to happen to Northern Ireland, and so the UK was able to seem as a more charitable person who was seen as more legitimate in their police state actions, which makes it harder for you to be able to hold them accountable, makes it harder for you to internationally be able to police them. Instead, the Republic of Ireland is the ones that gets screwed over for this, even though they are the ones who were screwed over by England in the beginning. At the end of this, maybe some people do not, the Unionists of Ireland still want to claim that their unification is good, but it would unquestionably be terrible for them. Northern Ireland would unquestionably get more investment if the UK actively believes that there is value in that property, and we think they are likely to when there is a risk of them leaving. Now that they are able to invest in that region prospers, get the rest of the benefits, and we also think that the Republic of Ireland does not suffer, does great new investment, so proud to all those.
I'll start with some responses to COs, then I'll talk about why things are bad without reunification, and without reunification they will never get better, and then I'll talk about how with reunification things get better. Rebuttal to opening, of course, I haven't forgot about them, that'll be integrated. On closing opposition, a big part of their case is about how this pisses off the UK. Prima facie, I think I would notice that that's a benefit, but maybe to go into a bit more depth on the issue of if the UK is, for instance, going to sanction Ireland, or do really bad things, or fund terrorists, etc. The first thing I would say is the UK isn't really in a position to do any of this, simply because they're already renegotiating trade deals with everyone else, the EU, Switzerland, Japan, the rest of the world. And insofar as they have really weak trade links right now, they're not in a position to put sanctions on Northern Ireland. Instead, basically what that amounts is them just putting sanctions on themselves, because if they restrict their trade, they also restrict their own trade. Second of all, we would point out to the fact that the UK can't possibly be that mad, because in order for this to happen, reunification to happen requires a successful referendum. And for a successful referendum to happen, it has to be called by the Home Minister. So if it is the case that the British government is really pissed at this happening, they're probably just really pissed at the Home Minister, and they're just gonna sack him or something like that. Third of all, we would point to the fact that, given all of our setup about the way the UK government structurally neglects the people of Northern Ireland, that a sanctions regime is functionally no different to what is happening right now. Because insofar as the people are neglected, insofar as their economic opportunities are fundamentally denied, we think that that basically amounts to sanctions, and insofar as we care about them imposing sanctions, they have already done that. What we bring here at closing government is an escape from those. And this also extends to other things like funding terrorists or supporting people to blow up places. Please don't do that. I think it's very unlikely that the UK is going to do this simply because of the huge risk of being found out, the risk of blowback, quite literally in this sense. So, moving on to the more substantive issues of why it is that things are bad and will not get better, I would like to start by noting that opening opposition gave no real reasons for why this is happening. They're things are bad, but they mostly focus on why it is that if we do this, things are going to get better. In closing government, we provide the unique contribution of showing exactly why it is that without reunification, Northern Ireland is always going to be a mess. The first was the UK's structure of production, the way that because it is so closely linked to the UK's economy, and the UK's economy, or the value add, is so concentrated to the south of England, that they're never going to be able to move into high profit sectors, and they're never going to be able to properly develop. The second was that they're neglected by UK parties, simply because, Labour doesn't actually run anyone in Northern Ireland, and the Conservatives are never going to win anything. The only issue that people in Northern Ireland vote on is independence, which means they either vote for Sinn Féin or the DUP or whoever else is allied with them, which means that no one can win any votes there, so they spend all of their money on places in the UK. Third of all, there's perpetual uncertainty, which means no one's going to want to risk their money by, for instance, building factories there. Fourth of all, there's no functioning internal government. It hasn't sat in over a year, which means that things are neglected. Roads aren't being built. Education is severely underfunded. Closing opposition has only one response to this litany of mechanisms, which is that, there's a risk of them leaving. The UK government's going to be really nice and hand out cash in order to stop them leaving. But Scotland, Wales, the UK loves neglecting places, and we think that is a function of them just simply feeling entitled to ownership of these places, and then systemically underestimating the risk of secession. But second of all, we would say that they care so much more about boondoggles for their voters, for instance, forcing the Parliament in Northern Ireland to fly the Union Jack rather than caring about more substantial issues. And that's because if they are to give significant cash back to people in Northern Ireland, everyone in England is going to feel really pissed off, and they're going to desert this party. So there's no votes to be won in Northern Ireland, which means that it's always going to be neglected. The impacts of this issue are threefold. First of all, it shows why there exists support for reunification, because insofar as these people are shackled to an old school colonial power that structurally neglects their needs, they're probably not going to want to be a part of that. Second of all, it basically does half of opening the government's case, because insofar as they say things could be good under reunification, we need to also show that things are bad without reunification. Third of all, it shows basically why on opposition you're going to get unrest and violence. The biggest harm of opening opposition was you get terrorism, for instance. But if it is the case that you have a class of people who are systemically neglected by the system, well, of course you're going to get civil unrest. That's probably the biggest reason why tensions are flaring up these days. That's a big contribution from closing government. Now let's talk about why things get better. We have three very powerful mechanisms. The first was that you just get a huge amount of cash. That's because, for instance, you are now tapped into EU funds, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of funds, or of euros, but also access to things like common debt, you have a better currency, etc. But also, because it is the case that it is likely a large number of people in Northern Ireland are pissed off at being part of Ireland, Ireland, or the Irish Republic of Ireland government, is probably going to be rather reconciliatory and is probably going to be spending a lot more because they don't want this to turn into a hellhole full of terrorism. And so it's going to be the case that they're happy to pull out the wallet, they're happy to invest in things, they're happy to tie it into supply chains with the rest of the country, which means you're going to get far more money there, far more investment, and far less uncertainty. Before that, opening.
Yeah, all of the mechanisms we give you about why nationalism is a particularly strong driver of violence and terrorism are exactly the same, no matter how the government handles reunification. How have you in any way dealt with our massive impacts on the people of both Northern Ireland and Ireland?
Okay, yeah, I'll respond to that later. Second of all, you get way better representation because, for instance, you're not represented by either the bunch of people who support reunification or the bunch of people that oppose reunification. In this case, you can actually get far better discourse because you can finally get rid of this one issue everyone's been relitigating over and over. Third of all, you get access to other EU benefits like free movement, like access to courts. None of this got any response. Oh, well, their problem. Responding to opening opposition, they have three general harms on the idea of, what happens. They say, first of all, no one wants this. We say they do or they will, demographic shift, but also they're simply being less memory of the Troubles. Although, the Troubles officially ended quite later, there were only really, really, really bad way earlier on. People only really, the younger people only remember the less bad tail end. The second thing they talk about is terrorism. Basically, the reason it happened during the Troubles was because the people who supported reunification would happily blow things up because they thought that could lead to reunification, and the people who opposed reunification would, blow things up in order to stop reunification from happening. But right now, if it's the case that it does reunify, maybe the Northern Irish people are going to do some act of terrorism, but it will quickly be stamped out. There's no real opposition there, and because there is no uncertainty anymore for them to fight over, reunification is something that is final and something they cannot resist. The last thing they talk about displacement is quite unlikely, and it's also contingent on reunification being a disaster, people wanting to leave. Compare this to opening government. Basically, we show that this gives you a far more stable trajectory into the future, in that it shows how you get far better representation, far better political change, but also far better economic change on a far greater and far more sustainable level, and that's why we're ahead.
You only just discovered that too, Leah.
My jokes have become much worse. I bet you really, really lay down the word.
Fuck. Puns
Not
are
really going
excellent.
to excel.
Yeah, we're good to go.
I'll one day
Shut up.
So let's start by dismantling the idea that this is a policy that would take place in a world where Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, vote for reunification. I think the only way that side government can set this debate in a world where Northern Ireland has voted for reunification is if they could demonstrate that there is a likely world that we could ever enter into. I think the fact that in 2016, after the Brexit referendum, we would expect that impetus to have Irish reunification would probably be at its maximum. At the point where the Udai Kingdom has literally, gotten out of the European Union, where if you cared a lot about, re-entry into the European Union, there probably would be high levels of people wanting Irish reunification. The fact that in opinion polls and referenda around the Brexit referendum in 2016 clearly demonstrated that Northern Ireland was not, keen on reunification, probably demonstrates that you probably, do have to stand behind some level of anti-democratic action in a world where you have Irish reunification. And no, it's not just we're saying, well, look at these opinion polls, that's why Northern Ireland would do this. There are a set of reasons why it's very unlikely Northern Ireland would ever want to have reunification. That there would likely be some catalyst, like this would likely act as some catalyst for an increase of terror that would be perceived as aggression against the Republic of Ireland for reasons which we tell you in extension, about how there is a history of Northern Ireland acting as a Protestant oppressor of the people of the Republic of Ireland. Or that additionally, as we tell you in extension, there are a set of reasons and incentives for the United Kingdom, specifically to reinvest in Northern Ireland. And divorced from what Thatcher did to Northern Ireland, you have to think about now, obviously the United Kingdom has reasons to want a stable Northern Ireland, and I think regardless of what you think about, what specific, areas the Tories are likely to be targeting electorally, the fact that you probably want a stable Northern Ireland probably would be a good thing for any political party to want to aim towards. I think there are reasons why the United Kingdom has incentives to reinvest in Northern Ireland. In this speech, I'm going to first start by comparing the closing half teams and explain how our extension interacts with what we get inside closing government, and then I'll deal with the remnants of what's left from the opening teams in this debate. So firstly, on comparing the closing half teams, I think that the largest contribution which we get inside closing government was an explanation of why access to the European Union, which presumably you would get in a world where you had Irish reunification, would replace some level of economic neglect that Northern Ireland had faced. Our claim in extension is that regardless of the impact this has to Northern Ireland, the more sympathetic actor in the debate is the Republic of Ireland, for reasons such as they have been the historical target of violence and oppression, specifically by people in Northern Ireland. That this makes sense given that the history of Northern Ireland being Protestant and Republic of Ireland being Catholic at the time where Protestants were gaining a vast amount of political capital and political power within the United Kingdom. I think that demonstrates we probably ought to adjudicate this debate not on what is the impact of Northern Ireland, but specifically what is the impact of the Republic of Ireland. And that's, I think, something that closing government does very little of in their extension. In contrast, we give you a number of reasons why it should be particularly bad for the Republic of Ireland. Now, firstly, this is likely to piss off the UK quite a bit. They're likely to do things like deny you access to trade, which is really important in this debate, because you have vastly lower trade with an incredibly geographically proximate country that presumably you would need to have strong trade relations with if you wanted to have a strong economy. Now, they say, well, the United Kingdom isn't in a position to deny a trade deal with this new Republic of Ireland for the reason that they just left Brexit and they want to sign as many trade deals as possible. The problem is, maybe they want to sign trade deals with other countries, but there are unique reasons why they would not want to sign trade deals with this newly formed Republic of Ireland. That is, specifically, this would increase impetus for people to want to have a Scottish referendum, which is something that we hear outside opening government, for example, and it's obviously something that the United Kingdom does not want. You're losing quite a lot of land, quite a large population and economic base in the country. Obviously, the United Kingdom has a very strong incentive not to want to do things that are likely to be encouraging Scotland to also have a vote and also have some level of independence. And I think there are a number of different ways, and I think that what that means that you are very likely to see the United Kingdom make a trade-off between, do we want increased impetus for a Scottish referendum? Is that something which we are likely to believe is beneficial? And is that something which, is that likely a trade-off which we want to accept if we do things like deny a trade deal or deny strong trade relations with the Republic of Ireland as well? Sure.
Ireland would be part of the EU and the EU trade deal with Britain. It also benefits by getting a much larger economy and access to a greater proportion of EU funds that are distributed on the basis of population. So it would benefit overall and your harm could not occur.
Alright, so I think that a large part of your case is obviously, well, maybe there are some benefits of EU membership. I would say firstly, it's kind of unclear specifically that all the benefits of EU membership are really that good. Like, it's not just that you get all of these economic benefits. There are also a set of different regulations, restrictions, and laws you have to adopt as a country as membership of the European Union. And historically, the Republic of Ireland has defaulted, for example, as a result of things like having to, opt into some of the regulations given by the European Union. It's unclear specifically that what you've demonstrated in this debate is that EU membership is strictly good for the Republic of Ireland. I think there are other detriments of joining the European Union as well. The second thing to say, though, is then, I think not necessarily there would be, a trade deal with the European Union. I think you also would want to have, for example, strong bilateral ties with the United Kingdom. I think you deny that opportunity as well. Last thing to say here, though, on a consideration of the closing government split in the debate, though, is that even if you don't believe any of our analysis of that why this is really particularly good for the Republic of Ireland, I think we also give you a set of reasons as to why economically the United Kingdom has reasons to want to do things that are good for the economy of Northern Ireland as well. Which means that if you believe that closing government's extension was mostly about economic harms to Northern Ireland, I think we give you a set of reasons why it is unlikely to be as important in this debate when you weigh out the contribution that we give as well. Lastly, very quickly, comparing what we give you to what we hear inside in the opening teams in this debate. I think there are a few things to point out about the opening teams in this debate. I think, firstly and very clearly, I think quite a lot of the material which you get does rely to some extent on factual assertion. You can talk about things like, the famed Belfast car bomb all you want. I don't think that necessarily, replaces structural analysis in this debate. Probably isn't enough for you to get ahead. What is enough for us to get ahead is giving you a metric on how to judge this debate. That is, which team benefits the Republic of Ireland the most. I think we're the only team that actually gives you reasons to believe that we do help the Republic of Ireland, and that's where we're coming from.